Hey guys, tonight we're drifting thousands of years back, all the way to ancient Egypt. The Nile is breathing beneath the night sky, its waters shimmering with flecks of silver moonlight. Somewhere along its fertile banks, the sweet, heavy scent of grapes clings to the warm air, and you can almost hear the distant hum of insects mixing with the gentle lapping of water. This was where secrets were kept, where couples met, and where the quiet intimacy of vineyard dates became a treasured ritual. And honestly, if you were living back then, without air conditioning, deodorant, or iced lattes, you probably wouldn't survive a week, just saying. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk slowly along the soft banks of the Nile, your sandals sinking slightly into the damp earth. The air smells of crushed leaves, river water, and the faint sweetness of ripening grapes. Around you, tall date palms sway gently, and you realize you've stepped into the very heart of ancient Egypt's secret dating culture, the vineyards, where couples came not just to drink wine but to steal whispers the way others might steal kisses. Somewhere nearby, you hear laughter, soft, muffled, playful. You imagine two young lovers ducking behind a cluster of hanging grapevines, their shadows barely outlined by the glow of flickering oil lamps. The vineyards here weren't just farms, they were stages for love stories, both whispered and forbidden. Think of them as the Starbucks of ancient Egypt, but with better wine and no Wi-Fi. You pass by rows of neatly cultivated vines, their branches heavy with small, pale green grapes that glimmer faintly under the starlight. The vineyards stretch endlessly, nurtured by the annual flooding of the Nile, which turned the surrounding land into rich, dark soil perfect for growing nearly anything, but especially grapes. Egypt's relationship with the Nile was intimate and fragile. Without its waters, none of this would exist, either the wine nor the quiet rendezvous that followed. Farther ahead, a group of workers hums an old hymn to Hathor, the goddess of love and music. The melody carries softly, like wind brushing over the water. You pause to listen, and suddenly, everything feels closer, their voices, their stories, even the faint heartbeat of a civilization balancing on the edge of survival. The air is warm, thicker than you'd like, and beads of sweat gather along your temples. You brush them away and can't help but mutter under your breath, "Yeah, climate control would have been nice." The further you walk, the more you realize vineyards weren't just about agriculture here. They were carefully designed for intimacy. Walkways were deliberately winding, providing privacy in a culture where public displays of affection were, let's just say, not encouraged. Families kept a close eye on courtships, and meeting someone you weren't already betrothed to? Risky business. But here, among the hanging vines and shadows, couples could escape expectations, just for a moment. It's hard not to picture a particular evening centuries ago. Oil lamps hung from thin branches, dripping faint resin as they burned. The air was filled with the smell of fresh figs and wine fermenting somewhere in clay jars. Somewhere beyond, a small gathering forms, a young scribe trying too hard to impress a girl from a merchant family, fumbling through an awkward joke about papyrus prices. You'd laugh if you could, although, to be fair, you probably wouldn't understand the punchline anyway. Wine, of course, played a starring role in these vineyard rendezvous. Ancient Egyptian wine wasn't just a drink, it was a statement. It told you something about wealth, status, and refinement. Imported amphorae from the Delta carried richer, sweeter blends reserved for nobles, while simpler, Local wines were poured into modest clay cups. And yet, when you sat beneath the vines on a warm night, a cup in your hand, it didn't matter which wine you had. What mattered was who sat across from you. Historians still debate whether vineyard dating was more common among the upper class or the working class. Some argue that these intimate gatherings were exclusive luxuries, tied to wealthy estates. Others point to papyrus fragments suggesting that even farmers' families hosted small feasts among their vines, celebrating harvests with neighbors and maybe sneaking in a little romance while no one was watching. It's one of those delightful gray areas of history, where no one can agree, and honestly, that just makes the stories more fun. As you move deeper into the vineyard, the air grows quieter, almost hushed. You can hear your own footsteps brushing against the sandy soil. It's easy to imagine the way this place transformed at night. The moonlit rows became something like a secret corridor, a sanctuary for whispered promises and soft laughter. There's something about being surrounded by life, vines heavy with fruit, the Nile breathing nearby, that makes the heart beat faster. And yes, okay, if you're wondering, why vineyards? Why not palm groves or the city streets? The answer is simple: control. Vineyard owners prize their crops too much to leave them unguarded. That meant workers, attendants, and constant supervision during the day, but at night? After the overseers left, the vines became quiet havens. No one came looking. No one interrupted. You catch a glimpse of something carved into a smooth slab of limestone near a narrow path, a crude little heart, 2 stick figures, and the faint symbol of Hathor scratched beside them. You smile, imagining some lovesick teenager 3,000 years ago thinking, "Yep, this'll impress her." Spoiler alert, probably didn't. Somewhere nearby, a breeze carries the faint, sweet tang of fermenting grapes, and you close your eyes for a moment. It's sticky, humid, and intoxicating. The air itself feels heavy with possibility. A few crickets chirp lazily, and a small frog plops into the shallow edge of the river. You take a breath, slow and deliberate, and it feels like the entire Nile Valley exhales with you. There's another secret about these vineyard dates, one you wouldn't guess unless you knew the culture intimately. Couples didn't just meet to talk or drink wine, they came to exchange gifts. Small tokens, like beads carved from turquoise, miniature amulets, or dried lotus petals wrapped carefully in linen. In a society obsessed with symbolism, these little offerings spoke louder than words. A lotus meant rebirth. A falcon feather whispered loyalty. And sometimes, just sometimes, a bunch of grapes carried a promise no one dared put into writing. You stop beneath a larger canopy of vines, where the fruit grows so dense it almost forms a curtain. It's quieter here, cooler, and the air smells faintly of crushed leaves. For a moment, you think about how timeless this scene is, how easily you could close your eyes and believe you were really here, thousands of years ago, sitting among ancient lovers who thought the same thoughts, felt the same butterflies, and carried the same small, fragile hopes. Behind you, the river murmurs softly. Ahead, the vineyard stretches endlessly, dotted with shadows that seem to move when you're not looking. A tiny oil lamp flickers somewhere deep in the rows, maybe marking the spot of another quiet meeting. You can't help but wonder what secrets those vines have overheard, what promises were whispered beneath their leaves. And as you keep walking, the question lingers: was it the wine, the privacy, or simply the magic of the place that made vineyard dates so irresistible? Maybe it was all three. Or maybe, like most things, the answer has been lost somewhere between the rows, carried away on the same soft Nile breeze you feel now. You follow the winding path deeper into the vineyard, your fingertips brushing against clusters of cool, plump grapes dangling like tiny green lanterns in the moonlight. The air grows heavier here, thick with the sweet, fermented scent of crushed fruit. You pause for a moment, taking it in. It's almost dizzying, like stepping into a perfume bottle someone forgot to close. And you can't help but think, yeah, this could either be romantic or a mild headache waiting to happen. Somewhere nearby, faint sounds of activity drift through the warm night. The soft scraping of clay jars, the low murmur of voices, the occasional splash of water. You follow the sounds until you find yourself standing at the edge of an open courtyard nestled among the vines. This is where the magic, and the mess, happens. Under the soft flicker of oil lamps, workers squat barefoot in large stone basins, rhythmically stomping on grapes in unison. Juice trickles down through narrow channels into waiting jars, and the air is alive with the smell of yeast and sugar. Ancient Egyptian winemaking wasn't glamorous. Forget sleek stainless steel tanks and shiny glass bottles. This was primal, sticky, and earthy. Grapes were harvested by hand, collected in woven baskets, and crushed immediately to keep them from spoiling under the relentless sun. The juice was poured into tall amphorae, sealed with mud and resin, then left to ferment in cool cellars carved directly into the earth. If you're picturing a rustic vibe mixed with a hint of controlled chaos, you're exactly right. And yet, for all its messiness, this was sacred work. Wine wasn't just a beverage in ancient Egypt. It was an offering, a status symbol, and for many, an aphrodisiac cloaked in divine blessing. Some of the finest amphorae were reserved exclusively for temples, where priests offered sweet red wine to the gods. But outside the temples, the drink became something else entirely, a quiet invitation, a signal passed between glances at a festival, a silent promise whispered under the vines. You lean against a low limestone wall, watching as a young man carefully dips his hands into a clay jar to stir the fermenting must, a fancy word for crushed grapes and skins. He hums softly, lost in his rhythm, and for a moment you can almost imagine him preparing this batch for someone special. Maybe he'll sneak a jar to a girl he's been meeting in the northern rows after sundown. Maybe this exact wine will be poured into small cups later tonight, sweet and heady under the starlight, shared between whispers and laughter. And that sweetness? That's the secret. Egyptian vineyards along the Nile produced some of the most delicate, honeyed grapes in the ancient world. The soil here was rich and loamy, constantly renewed by the Nile's floods, and the intense sun gave the fruit an almost concentrated burst of sugar. When fermented, the result was something soft, fragrant, and dangerously smooth. Historians still debate whether this was intentional craftsmanship, or just luck granted by the Nile's perfect climate. Either way, couples didn't seem to care. A few cups of this, and suddenly you'd find yourself confessing things you didn't even know you wanted to say. But here's the thing, wine wasn't for everyone. In early dynasties, it was reserved almost entirely for royalty and the elite. Pharaohs stored entire cellars of amphorae labeled with vineyard names, vintages, and even the identities of their winemakers. Yes, ancient Egypt had wine labels before it was cool. You can almost imagine a young noble bragging, "This one's from the Delta, aged 3 summers," while you're there pretending you can taste the difference. Spoiler, you probably couldn't. Yet the more wine became associated with celebrations and temple offerings, the more it trickled, quite literally, down into everyday life. By the New Kingdom period, even middle-class families had access to modest batches of locally fermented wine, made from smaller plots near their homes. Farmers tended tiny backyard vines, producing rough, Tarred reds that weren't exactly fine dining material but did the job perfectly well. You picture someone proudly offering you a cup, saying, "This one pairs beautifully with roasted goose." And you nod politely while your taste buds scream for water. Still, no matter your social class, sharing wine carried weight. In Egypt's symbolic language, offering someone a cup wasn't just hospitality, it was an unspoken invitation. Archaeologists have even uncovered small papyrus notes exchanged between lovers, fragments of scribbled lines mentioning a cup of the sweetest grapes, or an evening beneath Hathor's blessing. It makes you realize something timeless. People have been flirting through food and drink for thousands of years. Ancient Egyptians just had better grapes. You wander past a small shaded alcove where clay amphorae line the walls, each one carefully marked with a symbol to track where the grapes were grown. A stylized falcon for vines near the river delta. A crescent moon for those tended under Hathor's temple. And your favorite, a crude little drawing of two stick figures holding hands, scratched messily into one jar like an ancient inside joke. You can almost hear the winemaker laughing as he drew it, probably hoping no one would notice. But here's a fun, strange fact: some wines weren't just made from grapes. Egyptians experimented constantly, blending dates, figs, honey, and even lotus flowers into their brews. Imagine sipping something halfway between wine and dessert, perfumed with floral notes, maybe a little too sweet by modern standards. Couples, unsurprisingly, adored these blends, both for their taste and for their rumored effects. Some believed lotus wine could heighten passion, while others swore by date-infused reds for endurance. Let's just say that ancient Egypt had its own version of energy drinks, though without the jittery heart palpitations. You pause for a moment under an open trellis, looking up at the moonlight filtering through tangled vines. The world feels quiet here, wrapped in the hum of crickets and the gentle plop of distant irrigation channels. You imagine lovers walking these same paths, cups in hand, fingers brushing as they shared stories no one else could hear. Maybe they talked about the rising floodwaters. Maybe they laughed about their parents' matchmaking attempts. Or maybe they just stood silently, letting the soft air and the taste of wine do all the talking. Historians still argue over just how common vineyard dates really were. Some say they were rare, reserved for festival nights or secretive affairs. Others insist they happened constantly, that the vines became living witnesses to thousands of tiny romances scattered across centuries. The truth? You suspect it's both. Some stories became legend. Others stayed hidden among the roots, known only to the two people who met beneath the leaves. Suddenly, a soft breeze carries a strange mix of smells: crushed grapes, damp earth, and something faintly metallic. You follow it, and notice a small stone basin tucked under a fig tree, its edges stained dark from centuries of wine pressing. Someone once stood here, bare feet sticky with juice, working late into the night. You imagine them pausing to glance toward the rose, catching sight of two shadows slipping away together. Did they smile? Did they envy them? Or did they quietly pretend not to notice? That part's lost forever, and somehow, that makes the moment sweeter. You lean against the basin, running your fingers over its rough, cool surface, and you think about how fragile these moments are. A single broken amphora, a scrap of papyrus, a few carved hearts hidden in stone, and yet from these tiny fragments, we reconstruct entire worlds. Somewhere between the wine, the whispers, and the watchful gods, Egypt's vineyards became something more than farmland. They became theaters for longing, courage, and gentle rebellion. And as you step away from the basin, you realize the night has deepened, the stars burning brighter above the Nile's endless flow. The air hums with life, and somewhere nearby, soft laughter drifts faintly through the vines. You can't see the faces, but you know the story. Two people finding each other, just for tonight, just beneath these stars. And maybe, after a cup or two of that dangerously smooth wine, one of them leans in and whispers something they'll never forget. You follow the faint rhythm of drums and soft strings until the vineyard opens up into a clearing, bathed in the buttery glow of dozens of flickering oil lamps. Shadows stretch long across the sandy ground, dancing lightly over woven reed mats, and low tables stacked with clay cups and plates. The air is thick with warmth and spice, carrying the scent of grilled meats, crushed grapes, and something faintly floral drifting from garlands of lotus flowers strung around the trellises. You've stepped right into one of the Nile Valley's secret delights, a vineyard feast under the stars. Couples, families, and wandering musicians all gather here, celebrating the harvest, the river, and though no one says it out loud, the fleeting thrill of stolen moments in the dark. It's part festival, part ritual, and part, well, speed dating, Egyptian edition. Someone hands you a small clay cup filled with dark red wine. You raise it cautiously, sniffing the sweet, fermented aroma before taking a tentative sip. It's bold and syrupy, coating your tongue with honeyed warmth. You immediately understand why these gatherings had a reputation for romance. 3 cups of this, and suddenly every stranger in the crowd looks like destiny. You can practically hear ancient couples saying, "We met at a friend's vineyard party." Classic. Somewhere near the center of the clearing, a trio of musicians is seated cross-legged on woven mats. One plucks a lute carved from smooth cedar, another beats a shallow drum, and the third coaxes a delicate, almost haunting melody from a reed flute. The sound drifts lazily through the night air, mixing with murmurs of laughter and the soft rustle of leaves overhead. It's hypnotic, like the Nile itself has learned to hum a lullaby. You glance around and notice the tables nearby are piled high with dishes, roasted quail brushed with honey, bowls of figs and dates, small clay pots of salted fish, and pyramids of sesame cakes stacked like tiny edible obelisks. Egyptians love texture in their food, soft, chewy, crunchy, all in one bite. And you can tell these meals aren't just for eating, they're designed to impress. Picture a young merchant subtly sliding the biggest, ripest fig across the table to his date, like, "Here for you," totally not implying anything. But food wasn't just sustenance here, it was symbolic. A plate of figs whispered fertility. A cup of lotus wine hinted at passion. Even simple bread carried meaning when shared by hand. Couples would trade bites in silence, their fingertips brushing as lightly as the Nile breeze, and in that tiny gesture, entire promises were exchanged without a single word spoken. Somewhere behind you, a woman giggles softly, and you catch a glimpse of her ducking beneath a hanging curtain of grapevines. Her companion follows a heartbeat later, carrying 2 cups of wine. It's obvious where they're headed, and no one at the party seems to care, or maybe, everyone's just pretending not to. In Egypt, appearances mattered, but discretion mattered more. These vineyard feasts were the perfect solution, technically public, technically respectable, but full of hidden corners where shadows were thick and secrets even thicker. At one end of the clearing, a priest of Hathor raises a small golden chalice to the sky, murmuring a blessing in honor of the goddess of love and music. People bow their heads briefly, then immediately go back to flirting with the person next to them. That was the unspoken rhythm of these nights: honor the gods, toast the harvest, and then let the wine guide the rest. And Hathor's presence is everywhere tonight, in the music, in the scent of lotus petals, even in the carved amulets couples wear around their necks. Lovers believed that attending vineyard feasts under Hathor's blessing made their bonds stronger, their confessions sweeter, and, if the myths are to be trusted, their futures a little luckier. You overhear two women nearby whispering about a superstition. If you pluck a grape from the highest vine and eat it under the full moon, your love will endure as long as the Nile flows. That sounds romantic until you remember the Nile's been around for millions of years, and you wonder if someone's still waiting somewhere for a promise made in 1200 BCE. A little farther along, the music changes, shifting to a faster, brighter tempo. The crowd responds instantly. People rise from their mats and begin to dance in slow, undulating motions that mimic the river's current. Couples twirl beneath low-hanging vines, laughing as their shadows ripple like waves across the sandy floor. Someone accidentally knocks over a clay cup, splashing red wine across their tunic, and for a moment, you hear loud groans of sympathy, followed by the unmistakable laughter of someone clearly enjoying the spectacle. Dancing here isn't just entertainment, it's an act of expression. Some movements are traditional, invoking blessings from Hathor and Osiris, but others are playful improvisations meant to draw eyes and, let's be honest, impress potential partners. You spot one young man weaving between dancers, balancing a tray of cups while somehow never spilling a drop. Is he showing off? Absolutely. Does it work? Judging by the girl following 2 steps behind him, yes it does. And there's another detail you almost miss: the way people slip small gifts into each other's hands mid-dance. A polished shell, a bead carved from turquoise, a tiny strip of linen painted with a lotus. Each one carries meaning, part flirtation, part promise. You imagine the quiet thrill of receiving one, your pulse quickening, cheeks warming, even though no words are exchanged. Ancient Egypt had no dating apps, but trust me, they had the signals figured out. Then, as the night deepens, you notice something else. Not everyone here came for love. In the far corner of the clearing, a group of older nobles sits apart, sipping expensive Delta wine from tall alabaster cups. They lean close, whispering behind jeweled fingers, their sharp gazes sweeping the dancers like hawks watching prey. You catch snippets of conversation, mentions of land trades, temple donations, and, if you're not mistaken, a few names being matched together like pieces on a game board. These vineyard feasts weren't just about romance. They were also about alliances, negotiations, and delicate social maneuvering. And yet, among the whispers of politics and ritual, you can still hear something softer: bursts of laughter, soft sighs, the low hum of voices leaning close in the dark. Everywhere you look, small stories unfold. A shy glance held too long, a hand brushing another under the table, 2 strangers drawn together by nothing more than proximity and a shared sip of wine. You step back toward the edges of the vineyard, letting the music fade into the background. Above you, the night sky stretches wide, dense with stars, and the Nile glows faintly like liquid silver winding through the darkness. Somewhere beyond the trellises, someone plucks a lute softly, testing a new melody. A frog croaks lazily near the irrigation canal, and a firefly darts close before disappearing again into the shadows. You close your eyes for a moment and realize something important. These feasts weren't just parties. They were acts of permission, spaces carved out of strict rules where people could breathe, laugh, touch, and be touched, where a glance could become a memory, and a memory could become legend. The music fades behind you as you wander deeper into the vineyard, where the shadows grow longer, and the air feels heavier, warmer, almost conspiratorial. Oil lamps from the feast barely reach this far. Instead, the moonlight slips between tangled vines, silvering the edges of leaves and catching the faint glimmer of grapes still clinging to their stems. This is where the whispers live. You pause for a moment, letting your ears adjust, and slowly, faint sounds emerge from the hush, soft laughter carried on the breeze, the rustle of feet brushing sand, the low murmur of voices tucked away in secret corners. Here, hidden beneath the dense canopy of vines, couples meet, stealing minutes, stealing touches, stealing futures they're not sure they're allowed to dream about. If the feast was public theater, this is the backstage. No scripts, no audience, just risk and longing. And honestly, you can't help but feel like you've stepped into the draft folder of a very ancient, very forbidden dating app. Swipe right if you own grapes. You duck under a thick curtain of leaves, brushing them aside with your fingertips. The air here smells different, damper, sweeter, laced with the faint tang of crushed fruit and warm earth. Somewhere close by, two voices whisper in hurried tones, their words indistinct but urgent. You don't understand the language, but the rhythm gives everything away, the rising hush, the quiet laugh, the silence between phrases that stretches like elastic before snapping softly back into sound. You shift your weight, and your sandal presses into damp soil, leaving a clear imprint. You freeze, holding your breath. One of the whispers pauses, then resumes, softer this time, further away. Whoever they are, they're practiced at this. You realize, suddenly, how many feet have passed this way before, how many tiny rendezvous have played out between these vines, invisible to history yet somehow shaping it all the same. There's a narrow wooden trellis ahead, its beams bound together with papyrus rope, the grapes hanging thick and heavy overhead. Beneath it, someone's carved tiny marks into the soft wood, initials, maybe, or symbols you can't quite decipher. One, though, is clear, the looping outline of Hathor's sacred sistrum, the rattle-shaped emblem of the goddess of love. You run your fingertips over the shallow grooves, still faintly rough after thousands of years, and you wonder who carved it. A nervous boy hoping Hathor would bless his meeting? A girl marking the spot she'd always return to? Or maybe a lover etching proof that, yes, this moment really happened. Historians still argue over how secretive these vineyard trysts truly were. Some suggest that families turned a blind eye, knowing young lovers needed space to choose each other, even if official betrothals came later. Others insist these meetings were highly taboo, especially for women of noble lineage, where marriage was more contract than companionship. The evidence is scattered, fragments of papyrus letters, scratched graffiti, a few preserved poems that hint, just barely, at something like yearning hidden beneath formality. What we do know is this: the vineyards provided cover. Their tangled rows formed natural walls, and at night, when the overseers left and the shadows thickened, these places became sanctuaries for rebellion, tenderness, and everything in between. You hear soft footsteps behind you and turn instinctively, catching sight of two silhouettes ducking behind a lattice of vines. One of them carries a small clay jar, maybe wine, maybe something sweeter, you can't tell. The other holds a bundle of lotus petals, their pale shapes catching faint starlight like scattered pearls. They disappear quickly, swallowed by the night, and you're left alone again, the quiet pressing in around you. There's something strangely comforting about imagining their story, though. Maybe they're a young scribe and a temple dancer, meeting in secret because her family promised her to someone else. Maybe he sends her tiny scrolls folded into figs at the feast, each one carrying a line of poetry that's probably terrible but somehow perfect. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe they're just two people who happened to meet eyes once across a crowded market, and couldn't stop thinking about it. You shake your head and smile. Thousands of years pass, and humans never really change, do they? You crouch near an old stone trough half hidden under creeping vines. Inside, the soil is damp and cool, dotted with fragments of broken amphorae, the ghosts of long-drunk wine. Among them, you spot something unusual, a shard painted with delicate blue lines, depicting two figures seated close together beneath what looks like a trellis. Their hands almost touch, their bodies leaning inward in a way that feels intimate. This isn't temple art, meant to impress the gods. This is private, personal, human. And yet, as much as these tiny fragments tell us, there's so much we'll never know. Did these lovers ever marry? Were they separated by distance, class, or expectation? Did they meet here again tomorrow night, or was this the only time they ever sat together beneath these leaves? You realize, suddenly, that the silence of history isn't empty, it's heavy, crowded with all the whispers it couldn't catch. A soft breeze brushes your cheek, carrying the damp sweetness of crushed grapes and something sharper, smoke, maybe, from a nearby lamp gone out. You close your eyes and breathe it in, letting your other senses stretch out. You hear the hiss of cicadas in the dark. You feel the faint thrum of your pulse matching the rhythm of distant drums back at the feast. Somewhere, impossibly close, someone exhales sharply, and you realize just how alive the night still is. It hits you, then, why these secret vineyard dates mattered so much. Egypt was a place of rules, rituals, and responsibilities carved into stone, but here, under these vines, people reclaimed their choices, even if only for an hour. These weren't grand declarations or rebellions meant to rewrite history. They were tiny acts of living, breathing defiance. Quiet enough to be missed, soft enough to vanish, but powerful enough to linger in the bones of this place millennia later. Far ahead, a faint glow catches your eye, an oil lamp hanging low on a wooden stake, swaying slightly in the breeze. As you move toward it, the murmurs grow clearer again, a laugh, quick and breathless, a hushed promise whispered too softly to hear. You stop before reaching them, letting the shadows swallow you instead, unwilling to intrude on something so fragile. The lamp flickers once, twice, then steadies, painting the leaves gold. The grapes above you glisten like beads of glass. You stand there for a while, listening, not to understand, but to witness. And when you finally turn to leave, the night folds around you gently, like the Nile itself reaching up to wrap you in its quiet arms. You follow a narrow trail deeper into the vineyard until the vines thicken so densely that the air itself feels perfumed, rich with sweetness and something softer, almost powdery. It takes you a moment to realize why. Someone spilled perfume here. Not the kind you'd find bottled on a store shelf, but the kind blended by hand, drop by careful drop, thousands of years ago. Tonight, we step into a world of buayu, perfumed oils, and ancient seduction rituals. Because, believe it or not, vineyard dates in ancient Egypt weren't just about stolen moments beneath the vines. They were scented, scripted, and sometimes, a little magical. The first thing you notice is the smell. Lotus, honey, frankincense, cinnamon, all carried on the warm Nile breeze like whispers from an apothecary's dream. Egyptians didn't just use perfumes, they lived inside them. Oils, resins, and scented powders were layered like invisible clothing, signaling everything from wealth to devotion, and yes, desire. You pass by a small gathering under a woven reed canopy, where a young woman sits cross-legged grinding blue lotus petals into a shallow alabaster bowl. The petals bleed slowly into a rich, fragrant paste, and she mixes it with warmed oil from a clay flask, humming softly as she stirs. Her fingers shine under the lamplight, and you realize this mixture isn't for rituals or offerings. This is a love potion, subtle, invisible, meant to leave someone leaning just a little closer when they pass. You can't help but grin, thinking, forget modern dating apps, these people had aromatherapy down to a science. Egyptian couples believed that scents could speak when words couldn't. Blue lotus oil was said to calm the spirit and open the heart, making difficult confessions come easier. Frankincense was thought to awaken passion, its spicy smoke clinging to linen robes long after the fire died. Myrrh, deep and resinous, promised devotion, while cinnamon whispered playfulness. And if you wanted something truly potent, there were the infamous Nile blends, guarded recipes passed down secretly within families, oils so strong, some priests warned they could tempt the gods themselves. Historians still debate whether these perfumes worked as aphrodisiacs or if it was all in the mind, but one thing's certain, they mattered. Amphorae filled with perfumed oil have been found in tombs, carefully sealed to follow their owners into eternity. That says something, doesn't it? Even in the afterlife, nobody wanted to risk smelling boring. You duck beneath another archway of vines and catch sight of two figures seated close together on a woven mat. Between them sits a small tray of alabaster jars, their narrow mouths sealed with beeswax. One of them dips a reed stick into a jar, dabbing something golden along the inside of their wrist before offering it to the other. The gesture is silent, but the meaning is loud. Smell this, remember me. It's intimate, deliberate, and you realize just how much thought went into these vineyard encounters. It wasn't enough to show up, you had to arrive prepared. Clean linens freshly washed with scented natron salts, oils dabbed carefully along the pulse points, maybe even a bead or two of powdered malachite around the eyes if you wanted to impress. You chuckle softly at the thought. 3,000 years later, we're still doing the same thing. Different products, same strategy. But perfumes weren't the only tools of seduction. Some lovers turned to charms, tiny amulets carved with sacred symbols and tucked discreetly into folds of linen. A falcon for loyalty. A lotus for renewal. A coiled serpent to ward off rivals. And then there were these secret texts, short papyrus scrolls covered in handwritten invocations, folded so small they could fit in a closed fist. These weren't the grand spells of temple priests. They were personal, almost shy, asking Hathor or Bes, the mischievous dwarf god of love and music, for a little celestial assistance. You pause beside a small shrine set into the base of an ancient sycamore. Faded, broken, half swallowed by roots, yet someone once knelt here, murmuring their hopes into the hollow. You can almost hear them. Just one glance. Just one touch. Just tonight. And then there were the edible charms, the kind hidden in plain sight. Dates stuffed with pomegranate seeds. Honey cakes infused with saffron. Wine steeped with blue lotus petals until it glowed faintly under lamplight. These weren't served at the feast for everyone. They were made in quiet kitchens, prepared by careful hands, meant for exactly 2 people. Some were believed to bring courage, others to soften the heart, and a few were so notoriously effective that they were banned in certain temples. You imagine a young man slipping one of these, enchanted, dates into his companion's hand during a vineyard stroll, his smile just shy of innocent. Does it work? Hard to say. But judging by the scribbled graffiti found centuries later on a limestone wall nearby, a simple drawing of 2 stick figures holding hands under a vine trellis, you're willing to bet it did. Here's the funny thing, though, for all their sophistication, Egyptians weren't above superstition. There's a story recorded on a surviving fragment of papyrus about a girl who mixed her oils wrong, swapping myrrh for balsam, and ended up smelling so strong that she accidentally repelled half the feast. The text actually calls it the night of much loneliness. You can't help but laugh softly, imagining someone whispering afterward, "Always test the blend before the party." It's a reminder that even in an age of gods and kings, people were still people. They worried about smelling right, saying the right thing, choosing the right token. They wanted to be remembered, wanted to be wanted, just like now. The deeper you walk, the richer the air becomes, as though every step takes you through centuries of longing pressed into the soil itself. You catch faint trails of incense winding upward from somewhere nearby, swirling together with the cool dampness of the vines. Shadows move softly in the distance, couples leaning close, palms brushing, voices just loud enough to reach each other's ears and no one else's. It's then you understand, the vineyards weren't just a backdrop. They were a ritual space, designed not only for privacy but for transformation. Within these walls of green and shadow, a nervous stranger could become a confident suitor, a quiet promise could become a binding vow, and a fleeting glance could stretch into something that lasted lifetimes. And maybe that's why they layered themselves in scents and symbols and tiny magic spells, because they wanted to make this night, this moment, unforgettable. Far ahead, you spot a cluster of oil lamps gathered around a low stone platform. Small jars and carved amulets sit neatly arranged on its surface, and a young woman lights a stick of incense, letting the smoke curl into the night. It's an offering to Hathor, quiet and simple, a prayer for favor, for laughter, for love returned. She bows her head for a long moment, then rises and slips silently into the shadows, leaving the incense burning like a beacon in the dark. You stay there a while, watching the smoke drift upward, carrying with it 1,000 tiny hopes from 1,000 nameless lovers, long since vanished but somehow still here, still lingering in the vines and the warm Nile air. You drift back toward the edge of the vineyard, where the warm night air carries the faint buzz of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. The oil lamps from the feast glow faintly in the distance, but here, beneath the tangled canopy, shadows rule. For a moment you just stand still, letting the silence wrap around you like a linen shawl. And then, slowly, the thought settles in. This entire dance of secret vineyard dates existed because of rules. Not small rules either. Big ones. Ancient Egypt ran on structure, a society carved into layers as precisely as the hieroglyphs etched into temple walls. Marriage, property, inheritance, even your social life, all regulated by norms as old as the Nile itself. And yet, here you are, in a place deliberately designed to bend those rules, if only for a night. It's almost poetic, isn't it? Break the rules, but bring wine. The truth is, dating, at least how we think of it today, didn't technically exist in ancient Egypt. Families arranged most marriages, especially among nobles, merchants, and artisans. Love wasn't irrelevant, but it came after contracts, property agreements, and carefully balanced alliances. In theory, that was the respectable way. In practice, humans have always been a little inventive. You picture a young woman from a wealthy household, her life mapped out by her parents since birth, who she'll marry, when, and how much dowry will change hands. She knows his family name before she ever sees his face. Meanwhile, across the Nile, a farmer's son works in a vineyard, watching the river flood each season and wondering whether the girl he met at last year's harvest feast still remembers him. They weren't supposed to meet again. But here they are, tonight, under the same vines where the rules don't quite reach. Historians still debate just how strict these boundaries really were. Some argue that ordinary Egyptians had far more freedom than we assume, pointing to papyrus letters where men and women openly wrote about affection, heartbreak, even jealousy. Others believe the walls were higher, especially for women of status, whose reputations were tied to family honor. Somewhere between these arguments, you suspect, lies the truth. There were rules, yes, but there were also gaps. And those gaps? They're where the vineyards came in. Picture this: you're 17, and your mother has opinions about everything: your clothes, your manners, your future. You're expected to attend a temple festival tomorrow to meet suitable candidates. You nod, you smile, you promise to be on your best behavior. But tonight? Tonight you're here, slipping through the vines with someone who definitely doesn't make your parents' approved list. The vineyards offered privacy without rebellion. A festival gathering made your presence respectable, and the rows of tangled grapes created natural hideaways where no one asked too many questions. You weren't lying. You were celebrating the harvest. With someone very interesting. In a spot so hidden even the moon had to lean closer to watch. And then there were the curfew codes. Yes, they had them. Among the wealthy, unmarried women were often escorted everywhere by attendants, sometimes older female relatives, sometimes servants tasked with, how shall we put it, quality control. The vineyard solved that problem neatly. The crowds, the music, the wine, and the low light made it impossible to track everyone perfectly. It's not like anyone invented GPS yet. In one particularly amusing papyrus fragment, there's a complaint from a father about his daughter becoming too fond of great festivals. He warns that the vines teach mischief, which, let's be honest, is the most ancient-sounding parental complaint ever recorded. You can almost hear him sighing. Back in my day, people harvested grapes for wine, not romance. The upper class, though, played a different game. For nobles and royal courtiers, vineyard trysts weren't just about stolen kisses. They were political maneuvers. A whispered word here, a soft promise there, a quiet agreement sealed over a cup of Delta's finest red. Alliances were forged this way, sometimes literally in the shadows of the vines. And if a secret engagement needed negotiating? Well, nothing made inconvenient social rules more flexible than a generous gift and a little plausible deniability. But for ordinary people, the stakes were more personal. A bad match could trap you for life. A forbidden love could sever family ties. That's why these hidden vineyard meetings mattered so much. They weren't grand rebellions. They were small breaths of freedom, carved carefully into lives otherwise bound by duty. You paused near an old sandstone wall at the vineyard's edge, running your fingers along shallow grooves cut into its surface. Symbols, faded, nearly lost, hint at secret pacts made long ago. A falcon etched above a lotus, meaning fidelity beneath renewal. Two intertwined spirals. Paths crossing by fate. Someone once stood right here, carving their defiance into stone, hoping it would outlast the whispers. Nearby, a faint giggle cuts through the hush, followed by hurried footsteps brushing against leaves. You turn just in time to see two figures darting between the vines, their outlines soft and blurred beneath the low moonlight. They vanish in seconds, leaving only the faint perfume of blue lotus lingering in their wake. Some archaeologists believe there were even unspoken zones, areas of the vineyard everyone knew were meant for couples seeking privacy. They point to consistent clusters of discarded amphorae and worn-down patches of earth, hidden far from the main paths. It's like ancient Egypt had invented quiet corners, long before cafes ever did. And no, Historians haven't agreed on whether these zones were tolerated or simply overlooked, but judging by how many lovers' carvings we've found, the vines seem to have kept a few secrets of their own. You can't help but smirk at the thought. Parents called it mischief, historians call it cultural nuance. Same thing, really. By now, the night has grown thicker, heavier, as though the Nile itself has exhaled a warm breath over the valley. Somewhere far off, a lute strums lazily, its soft melody carried on the wind. Back near the feast, laughter swells, then ebbs like a tide. Here, though, the silence is broken only by the occasional crunch of grapes beneath hurried footsteps and the low, secretive tones of voices keeping their stories tucked carefully between breaths. You understand it now. Vineyards weren't just escapes, they were thresholds. Step inside, and you crossed into a quieter world, one where rules bent just enough to let the heart move freely. For a few hours, hierarchies dissolved. Names, titles, reputations, none of it mattered under the vines. And when the sun rose, everyone went back to their roles, their duties, their futures. But tonight, under these leaves, they were simply themselves. You wander deeper into the quiet vineyard until the air changes, softer now, thicker, carrying a faint sweetness of blue lotus mixed with the warm scent of crushed grapes. The lamps from the feast are distant here, their glow reduced to a fragile amber haze behind you. Ahead, though, a soft shimmer catches your eye, a tiny shrine, barely taller than your knee, tucked beneath a curtain of vines. The sandstone is worn smooth by centuries of river winds, and yet, carved clearly on its face, you see her unmistakable symbol, the sistrum of Hathor. Tonight you step into her domain. Hathor, goddess of love, music, beauty, fertility, and wine. If these vineyards were stages for secrets and whispered promises, Hathor was their silent patron, watching from the shadows, her presence woven into every cup, every song, every stolen glance. The people believed her hand guided their hearts, shaping the way they loved, laughed, and lingered beneath these vines. And honestly, considering the amount of wine involved, you can't help but think she had a very good sense of humor about it all. You kneel briefly, brushing dust from the shrine's base, where small offerings still rest, a handful of dried lotus petals, an empty alabaster jar once filled with perfumed oil, and a single grape, shriveled but placed carefully as though meant to last forever. You imagine the quiet ceremony behind this gift, someone whispering Hathor's name, closing their eyes, and praying for courage before slipping away to meet someone beneath the vines. Hathor wasn't just a distant, untouchable deity. She was present here, among ordinary people, woven into the fabric of their daily lives. In temple murals, she's shown with a broad, serene smile, cow horns framing a sun disk atop her head, her hands lifting a golden sistrum, a musical rattle said to soothe the heart and awaken joy. In the vineyards, that symbol wasn't just art. It was permission to laugh, to flirt, to follow the pull of desire, at least for a night. A low hum drifts from somewhere beyond the vines, and you follow it until you find a small group gathered around a clay amphora, their voices weaving together in an ancient hymn. Hathor, Lady of the West, who dances where the lotus blooms, guide our hearts as the river flows. The melody is soft, repetitive, almost hypnotic. You feel it before you understand it, the way it seems to breathe with the earth beneath your feet. One of the singers cradles a jar in both hands, lifting it slightly before placing it on a flat stone and pouring a thin stream of wine into the soil. It's an offering, a simple gesture meant to invite Hathor's blessing. You pause, watching silently, as a few dancers begin to sway nearby. Their movements are fluid, slow, like water flowing around invisible bends. Bare feet press softly into the damp earth, anklets chiming faintly as the sistrum rattles in time with the rhythm. It's not performance, it's invocation. You feel the night shift around you, the air charged with something unspoken. And then it hits you, this isn't just a party. These vineyard dates weren't random, they were rituals. You step closer to the dancers and notice small details. Necklaces of polished carnelian glinting in lamplight, tiny amulets etched with Hather's name, sprigs of lotus tucked behind braided hair. Couples exchange sidelong glances as they move, the ritual blurring into intimacy until it's hard to tell where worship ends and longing begins. It's subtle, quiet, but electric. Somewhere, a young man kneels to tie a strip of linen around his wrist, murmuring a prayer into his palm before pressing it to his lips. His companion leans in, fingertips brushing his hand as though sharing in the blessing. No one speaks of it aloud, but everyone knows what's happening. They bound themselves to Hather tonight, trusting her to guide the rest. Historians still debate how much of this was faith and how much was cultural habit. Were these vineyard rituals truly sacred, or were they clever excuses for romance under divine cover? Some argue Hather's temples actively encouraged love and pleasure as expressions of life's fullness. Others insist the religious framework simply gave people the freedom to bend social rules without consequence. Either way, the goddess became the quiet alibi behind countless whispered promises. It wasn't uncommon to hear phrases like, "Hather willed it," murmured with a smile after someone returned home late from the feast. Translation: Don't ask questions, I'm invoking divine protection. Honestly? Genius! But Hather's influence ran deeper than flirtations and festivals. Her mythology shaped how Egyptians understood desire itself. They believed she embodied duality, joy and longing, playfulness and passion, sweetness and power. In one myth, she's called the Golden One, whose laughter was said to shake the pillars of heaven. In another, she transforms into the fierce lioness Sekhmet, her rage scorching the desert. To Egyptians, love wasn't safe or simple. It was wild, untamed, sometimes ecstatic, sometimes destructive. And where better to dance with that chaos than here, in the vines, where night and shadow conspire to blur the lines. You wander past a half-buried fragment of limestone carved with Hather's image, her serene face framed by lotus flowers, her sistrum lifted mid-song. The stone is cracked, worn by centuries, but the expression endures, warm, knowing, amused, as though she's been watching all of this unfold for thousands of years. Nearby, discarded amphorae lie tipped against tree roots, their dark stains still faintly visible. You crouch to examine one and spot a painted symbol near its base. Two intertwined vines curling into a heart shape. Not temple-approved art, too casual, too personal. Someone marked this jar for someone else, maybe as a private gesture, a tiny rebellion against strict expectations. You can almost hear them whisper, "Remember me when you drink this." And here's a strange, little-known fact. Some vineyard feasts dedicated entirely to Hather had secret rules. Couples were instructed to bring one gift, something fragrant, symbolic, and small, to leave behind in the vines. A bead carved from turquoise. A strip of linen perfumed with myrrh. A single grape chosen at random. The idea was simple. Love wasn't just about taking. It was about giving a piece of yourself to the earth, to the goddess, to time itself. Archaeologists have found clusters of these offerings buried shallow beneath vineyard soil, jars of dried lotus, bundles of incense, even tiny reed baskets still holding seeds. It's haunting, knowing that so many people stood right where you're standing, hearts full, hoping Hathor would hear their unspoken words. Somewhere behind you, laughter ripples softly, bright, fleeting, alive. You turn and catch sight of two figures moving together through the vines, one carrying a small lamp, the other clutching an offering wrapped carefully in linen. They pass beneath a wooden trellis, heads close, shoulders brushing. For a brief second, they glance your way, their faces touched by light, and then they vanish into the shadows, leaving the faint perfume of blue lotus drifting in their wake. You stand there for a long moment, watching the night close behind them. You can almost believe Hathor herself is here, smiling somewhere unseen, scattering blessings like starlight across the vineyard floor. The air feels cooler here, as though you've stepped into another pocket of time. The rows of vines fall silent, and the sounds of the feast are far behind you now, just a faint murmur swallowed by distance. What stretches ahead looks like ordinary vineyard soil, dark and rich from centuries of Nile floods. But hidden beneath this earth are fragments of untold stories, the small, quiet evidence of love that refused to stay buried. Tonight we're not just wandering, we're excavating memories. You crouch near a patch of churned soil where the ground dips slightly. Embedded in the earth, half swallowed by roots, is a smooth shard of pottery. You ease it free, brushing away dust until faint painted lines emerge. Two figures sitting beneath an arch of grapes, their faces turned toward each other. One hand reaches forward, holding what looks like a small cup. The other hand hovers inches away, frozen in a moment that feels impossibly intimate. This isn't temple art. It isn't propaganda carved for kings. It's personal. Human. Someone painted this, maybe thousands of years ago, for someone they couldn't forget. And somehow, across all that time, the gesture still feels alive beneath your fingertips. Archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of fragments like this in vineyards along the Nile. Tiny slivers of clay, faded limestone carvings, and stray hieroglyphs etched into trellises. Each one carries its own quiet echo. Some depict feasts, dancers, and lotus flowers floating in bowls of wine. Others are, well, less subtle. You come across a fragment showing two figures holding hands beneath the unmistakable symbol of Hathor, their heads bowed close enough to almost touch. You smile softly. Ancient Egypt didn't exactly invent PDA, but they may have perfected the art of subtle suggestion. And here's the fascinating part. None of these artifacts were officially recorded or sanctioned by temples. They weren't grand narratives commissioned by pharaohs or priests. They were private expressions, graffiti sketches, love notes etched into whatever was nearby. Tiny rebellions captured in clay and stone. You can't help but think, 3,000 years ago, someone was doodling their crush during work hours, and somehow, it survived to make you smile right now. Humanity's brand? Consistent. Further along the path, you spot a small sandstone block leaning awkwardly against a vine stake. When you wipe away a layer of dirt, faint hieroglyphs emerge, their edges softened by centuries of weather. The inscription is brief, almost careless. Under these vines I found her voice sweeter than wine. You pause, tracing the grooves with your thumb, and you feel something tighten in your chest. It's not poetry by modern standards, but there's weight in its simplicity. Someone once stood right here, overwhelmed by a moment so fleeting they carved it into stone just to make it last. Historians still debate whether this inscription refers to a specific lover or if it's part of a larger ritual poem. Some argue it reflects Hathor's blessing, others believe it's literal, a scrap of someone's personal memory immortalized by chance. Either way, it feels less like history and more like confession, the kind you whisper only to the earth, hoping the Nile carries it away. A little farther ahead, you find the remnants of a painted wall, just a fragment, but enough to catch your breath. The scene shows a vineyard feast beneath a canopy of woven palm fronds. Couples lounge on reed mats, cups raised, musicians seated cross-legged with lutes and flutes. At the edge of the mural, barely noticeable unless you're looking for it, two figures slip between the vines, their shadows melting into darkness. It's subtle, almost secretive, an artist hiding a tiny story in the margins. You imagine them smiling as they brush the paint, knowing only a careful eye would ever find it. Ancient Easter eggs, 3 millennia early. The more you look, the more patterns emerge. Archaeologists have found clusters of amphorae buried in unlikely spots, far from pressing pits and storage cellars. When opened, many still carry faint traces of perfumed wine, blends of blue lotus, honey, and cinnamon, likely prepared for private rituals rather than festivals. Some jars bear carved initials, stick figure etchings, or miniature grape clusters scratched onto their bases, as though marking ownership. One amphora fragment even carries a short line written in demotic script. The heart beats faster than the eyes. A cryptic note, simple but layered, suggesting lovers meeting before they were allowed to see each other publicly. Maybe it was a playful inside joke. Maybe it was a warning. No one knows. And somehow, that uncertainty makes it even more intimate, like reading the edges of someone else's diary without ever seeing the pages. Here's the strange, delightful thing about these discoveries. They contradict what we thought we knew. For years, scholars believed ancient Egyptian relationships were entirely transactional, bound tightly by family and politics. But these fragments, the pottery, the carvings, the casual graffiti tucked between hieroglyphs, tell another story. They whisper about choice, desire, and quiet defiance. Some historians argue we're reading too much into them, projecting modern emotions onto old symbols. Others point to patterns too consistent to ignore, similar imagery recurring across sites hundreds of miles apart, inscriptions left by hands that never met but carried the same longing. It's like the Nile itself carried secrets downstream, scattering pieces of the same story across time and distance. And then there are the hidden caches. In the Delta region, archaeologists uncovered shallow pits beneath certain vineyard terraces, where bundles of linen-wrapped items lay carefully arranged, beads carved from turquoise, shells painted with red ochre, small reed baskets containing dried lotus blossoms. Offerings? Maybe. Tokens exchanged between lovers? Possibly. Some pits even contain paired objects, 2 matching amulets, tied together with a single faded thread. Whatever they meant, someone wanted them buried together, untouched, until someone like you stumbled across them thousands of years later. You hold one of these tiny offerings in your palm, just a carved bead, smooth and unremarkable except for the way it fits perfectly against your skin. You think about the hands that placed it here, how deliberate the motion must have been, and you feel it, the weight of someone else's hope, suspended in time. A soft breeze rustles the leaves above, carrying the faint murmur of the Nile somewhere beyond the horizon. You close your eyes and for a moment the distance collapses. You can almost hear footsteps crunching softly on ancient soil, hushed laughter behind trellises, the clink of clay cups in the dark. These vineyards hold memories layered like sediment, thousands of small stories pressed into the earth until they became indistinguishable from it. And maybe that's the most extraordinary thing. Time erases faces, names, voices, but somehow, fragments survive. A carving here. A painted figure there. A single line of longing etched into sandstone. Enough to remind you that behind the monuments and myths, these were people, messy, hopeful, imperfect people, stealing kisses in the shadows of the vines and leaving behind little pieces of themselves for you to find. The night air grows warmer as you wander deeper into the vines, and for a moment, you pause beneath an arch heavy with ripe grapes. The silence here is soft, comforting, but the ground beneath your sandals still carries the weight of untold stories. Until now, we've followed the rituals, the offerings, the whispered promises, but tonight, let's peel back another layer of the vineyard's secrets. Because if you thought these ancient vineyard dates were just wine, music, and stolen glances, oh no. The Egyptians had tricks. They had plans. And some of them were clever, some scandalous, and a few, surprisingly hilarious. You duck beneath a curtain of leaves, and almost immediately, the air changes, warmer, thicker, and faintly sweet, carrying the subtle scent of honey and spice. Ahead, near a small woven mat, a young woman kneels with deliberate precision, arranging tiny pastries on a reed tray. They're bite-sized, dusted with something golden, and she handles them like treasures. These are no aphrodisiac, great cakes, whispered about in surviving fragments of Egyptian texts, believed to spark desire and soften the heart. They weren't sold publicly, of course. They were prepared quietly in private kitchens, recipes guarded as fiercely as temple scrolls. The secret? Grapes mashed with pomegranate seeds, honey, and just enough blue lotus essence to give them a faint floral sweetness. Were they truly magical? No one knows. But judging by the little scribbles found etched into limestone near vineyard paths, tiny hearts, stick figures holding hands, even the occasional "Blessed by Hathor," carved in playful hieroglyphs, you can guess the belief alone was powerful enough. And honestly, if someone handed you a warm, honeyed cake under starlight, while whispering Hathor's name in your ear, you'd probably believe in magic too. But the aphrodisiac cakes were just the beginning. Egyptians had an entire catalog of secret beauty tricks designed specifically for nights like these. Forget modern self-care routines. These people were innovators. You pass a small group seated cross-legged near a clay basin filled with crushed rose petals and warm water. They dip linen cloths into the mixture, dabbing the scented water gently along their necks and wrists. It's subtle, but when the breeze carries the fragrance, it clings delicately to the skin, trailing behind them like an invisible calling card. Then there's kohl, powdered galena mixed with oils, applied carefully around the eyes not just for beauty but for practical reasons, too. It kept glare down during the day and repelled pesky flies at night. But here, beneath the vines, it also framed glances in ways impossible to ignore. A tilt of the head, a raised brow, the faint shimmer of lamplight against dark-lined lashes, subtle, but devastating. And yes, even the men had their rituals, perfumed beards, oils brushed into braids, amulets polished until they caught the faintest flicker of firelight. Everyone came prepared, because in a vineyard filled with wine and whispers, being unforgettable wasn't optional. Somewhere nearby, laughter bubbles softly, and you glance over to see two figures kneeling beneath a low trellis. One of them pulls a small clay jar from their robe and opens it with exaggerated care. A rich, amber-colored paste glistens inside, catching the faint starlight. They dip a finger in and dab the mixture lightly behind their ears, grinning mischievously. You recognize it instantly. Perfumed honey oil, another secret weapon, mentioned in a handful of ancient cosmetic texts. Blended with cinnamon and myrrh, it warmed against the skin, releasing a sweet, resinous aroma believed to ensnare the senses. Whether it worked scientifically or not, Well, the smug little smile on the person applying it suggests they believed it did, and that's probably all that mattered. One surviving papyrus even warns, "Do not wear too much, or your scent will speak louder than your words." You can't help but laugh softly, a reminder that, apparently, overdosing on perfume has been ruining first dates for at least 3,000 years. And then there were the, let's call them conversation strategies. Imagine you're meeting someone for the first time under a starlit trellis. You have two choices. Talk about the Nile flood cycles. Offer them a honey cake and a cup of lotus wine, while casually dropping that you know a secret prayer to Hathor. Guess which one worked better? Some papyrus fragments even include tiny, flirtation poems, short, playful lines scribbled in personal handwriting rather than temple calligraphy. One recovered piece reads, "Your voice is sweeter than figs. Your breath warmer than new bread. Come walk where the vines hide us." It's direct, simple, and honestly, more effective than half the dating profiles out there today. But beyond cakes, perfumes, and poetry, there's a deeper truth hiding here. These little gestures weren't just about attraction. They were about creating memory. Egyptians understood something we sometimes forget, that love wasn't built on grand gestures, but tiny, layered ones. The sound of anklets chiming in time with distant drums. A smear of honey clinging to someone's fingertips. A drop of perfume catching the breeze just as they leaned close to speak. These details became anchors. Long after the feast ended and the cups were empty, a lingering scent or a remembered taste could pull someone back to this night, this moment, beneath these vines. Historians still argue about how much of this was real science versus cultural theater. Did the blue lotus actually affect mood? Did aphrodisiac cakes really soften the heart? Or was it all the placebo effect? Some researchers insist the effects were exaggerated, pointing to experiments with surviving recipes. Others argue the opposite, that these botanical blends had compounds capable of relaxing the body and amplifying sensation. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Maybe it wasn't the cakes, or the perfumes, or even the prayers to Hathor. Maybe it was the setting, warm air, starlight, soft music drifting from the feast, and the quiet thrill of secrecy under the vines. Sometimes magic doesn't live in the ingredients. It lives in the moment you believe in them. You reach a small alcove carved into the vineyard wall, where fragments of painted limestone lean in careful rows. Among them, a tiny etching catches your eye, two hands reaching toward each other, fingertips barely touching, framed by a carved cluster of grapes. Beneath the image, a single line of demotic script reads, "I met you by taste before I knew your name." You close your eyes for a moment, breathing in the heavy scent of ripening fruit and crushed petals, and you almost feel the heartbeat of this place, layered, complex, impossibly human. These vineyards weren't just farms. They were laboratories for longing, testing grounds for hope, and silent archives of every laugh, glance, and soft confession lost to time but somehow still alive in the earth beneath your feet. The night grows heavier as you drift toward the deeper rows of vines, where shadows thicken like spilled ink, and the air smells faintly of ripened grapes and damp earth. Somewhere far behind, the feast continues, laughter spilling into music, cups clinking faintly in the distance. But here, the silence holds something else entirely, the quiet tension of unspoken boundaries. Because beneath the stars, in these secret vineyards, love wasn't just about perfume and lotus wine. It was also about status, power, and defiance. And tonight, we step into the delicate dance between Tinyuva Jai Cap, a hidden battlefield where desire sometimes crossed lines carved deep into stone. You pause near a cluster of vines where 3 clay amphories sit tipped on their sides, their surfaces stained with faint rings of dried wine. One bears a carved mark you've seen before, a falcon above a lotus, meaning fidelity beneath renewal. But tonight, the symbol feels heavier. Because not everyone here was free to choose whose hand they wanted to hold beneath these trellises. Ancient Egypt was a society of layers stacked like limestone blocks. Pharaoh and royal family at the top. Nobles and high priests beneath them. Scribes, merchants, and artisans filling the middle. Farmers and vineyard workers, essential yet invisible, at the foundation. And each layer carried its own rules, written and unwritten, about who could marry whom, who could speak to whom, and most importantly, who could be seen with whom. Yet here, beneath these tangled leaves, the rules blurred. Imagine a young nobleman at a vineyard feast, seated on a low reed mat beside his family, sipping carefully aged Delta wine from an alabaster cup. Nearby, a vineyard worker tends the lamps, her hands sticky with crushed grapes, her linen robe simple, unadorned. By daylight their worlds would never meet, her name wouldn't even appear in his family's scrolls. But tonight? Tonight the music softens, shadows lengthen, and for a brief moment, the weight of titles disappears under the vines. You can almost see them slip into the narrow paths, drawn by a quiet understanding neither can name. A glance becomes a conversation. A conversation becomes a secret. And suddenly, the distance between noble and worker feels smaller than the space between 2 hands reaching in the dark. Historians still debate how often this happened. Some insist vineyard romances rarely crossed class boundaries, pointing to strict family controls and elaborate marriage contracts preserved on papyrus. Others argue the opposite, pointing to artifacts, love poems etched into humble limestone fragments, small matching amulets buried together, traces of shared offerings, from couples who clearly didn't come from the same status. One particularly striking find comes from a vineyard site near Abydos, where archaeologists uncovered 2 amulets carved from lapis lazuli, a luxury reserved for nobility, tied together with faded linen threads. Beneath them, fragments of pottery bore markings typically used by workers rather than merchants or elites. 2 names, 2 worlds, bound deliberately and buried carefully, as though hoping someone in the future might understand. And you stand there now, fingertips brushing history, and you do understand. The vineyards acted like neutral ground. Festivals brought together people from every layer of society, wealthy landowners, scribes keeping temple records, workers pressing grapes, even merchants hauling amphorae across Nile barges. Here, surrounded by wine and music, you could sit beside someone you'd never otherwise meet. And Hathor's blessing, invoked at nearly every feast, gave people cover. Because if love was divine, who could argue with the goddess herself? If someone asked awkward questions later, well, Hathor willed it, made for a convenient explanation. Subtle, plausible, and honestly brilliant. But crossing those invisible lines wasn't without risk. There are papyrus records describing fathers disowning daughters who fell in love beneath their station, or mothers sending relatives to shadow their sons during feasts. For propriety. One fragment even recounts the story of Meritor, a wealthy merchant's daughter who disappeared into the vines with a vineyard steward during a harvest celebration. The scroll says delicately, her family sent her north to study temple service. Translation: someone got caught, and someone got grounded. Ancient edition. You can't help but smirk. 3,000 years later, parents haven't changed. Still, not all vineyard romances ended in scandal. some were quiet rebellions that lasted. One particularly rare marriage contract discovered near Memphis records an unusual clause: a noblewoman of modest rank securing formal rights for her vineyard worker husband to inherit her land. The papyrus is stained brittle, but the signature seals remain intact, evidence of a love strong enough to push past rules carved deep into society's bones. Were they exceptions? Absolutely. But exceptions tell us something important. Even in a rigid world, where lineage and reputation shaped everything, desire found ways to slip between the cracks. You keep walking, the vineyard stretching endlessly in silver-dusted rows, until you reach a narrow archway carved into sandstone. It's half buried beneath creeping vines, but when you brush the leaves aside, faded reliefs emerge. The scene shows three figures seated under grape-laden trellises, one dressed in fine pleated linen, one bare-shouldered and simple, and between them, a small amphora balanced on a low stool. Their hands hover above the jar, fingertips nearly touching, faces turned slightly toward each other but never fully meeting. It's cautious, subtle, almost secretive. Whoever carved this understood the risk, but carved it anyway. And here's a strange, beautiful detail. Some vineyard graffiti survives that doesn't even name people, just symbols. A falcon etched beside a simple clay cup meaning, "I choose you beneath Hather's gaze." Two lotus blossoms linked by a vine. Our paths entwined. A single palm tree scratched into limestone, surrounded by dozens of tiny dots, interpreted by archaeologists as stars, marking a single, unforgettable night. No names, no dates, no witnesses. Just fragments of longing tucked quietly into stone, waiting thousands of years for someone, maybe you, to find them. Somewhere behind you, soft footsteps crunch over dry earth. Two figures pass through the moonlight, one draped in fine linen, the other in simpler robes. They walk side by side, careful, close but not touching, their shadows blending until you can't tell them apart. For a moment you want to call out, to warn them of the risks, but then you stop. Because maybe that's the point. Maybe the whole magic of these vineyards was that, here, love didn't have to ask permission. The night deepens, and the vineyard feels quieter now, not because it's empty, but because the secrets here grow heavier the farther you wander. The soft hum of insects has replaced the distant music, and the moon hangs low, silvering the tangled vines until they look like threads in some forgotten tapestry. Tonight we leave the soft murmurs of hidden dates behind and step into a world where wine wasn't just romance, it was power. Because under these vines, amphorae didn't just hold sweet, fragrant reds. They carried alliances, whispered promises, and sometimes, the fates of kings and queens. Welcome to the dangerous intersection where Ruavang Vog Win Luke intertwine. You pause near a cluster of clay amphorae stacked beneath a trellis, their rounded bellies catching the dim glow of a single hanging oil lamp. Each one is marked carefully with painted glyphs, vineyard origin, year of harvest, and sometimes even the name of the vintner. These aren't casual drinking jars. These are the good stuff, Delta blends, aged under careful watch, destined not for ordinary feasts but for private chambers and royal tables. Wine was a language in ancient Egypt, one only the powerful spoke fluently. A single amphora of Delta's finest could seal a trade agreement, smooth over a political rift, or, depending on the hands exchanging it, promise something far more personal. A jar wasn't just a gift, it was leverage. And here's the thing, the vineyards weren't neutral. The best of the best were tied to estates controlled by priests, noble houses, and even the royal family. Whoever owned the vines controlled access to the amphorae that mattered, and whoever controlled the amphory, well, let's just say they controlled more than wine. A story survives, scratched faintly onto a limestone tablet now crumbling in a museum basement. It tells of a feast held during the reign of Amenhotep III, where a rare batch of Delta wine, dark, perfumed, and aged in cedar-sealed jars, was served exclusively to the king's inner circle. But later that night, 2 amphorae mysteriously went missing, spirited away by a palace servant rumored to be entangled with a high-ranking noblewoman. The servant disappears from the records after that. The noblewoman, however, shows up a few months later in a papyrus letter complaining of jealous tongues and dangerous gossip. Historians can only speculate what happened, but here, standing beneath these same tangled vines, you can almost see it play out: a stolen jar, a quiet knock, a whispered invitation, and the kind of secret you carry to your grave. Somewhere nearby, soft voices drift through the dark. You creep closer, careful not to step on fallen grapes, and spot 2 figures seated cross-legged on woven mats. Between them sits an alabaster jar, its surface carved with Hathor's symbol and capped with resin. This isn't festival wine. This is a political gift, the kind reserved for moments when words aren't enough. The taller figure leans forward, speaking low and measured. The other listens, hands clasped, expression unreadable. You can't make out the details, but the tension in the air is palpable. The jar placed between them is more than drink, it's negotiation, temptation, and promise, all in one. And you can't help but wonder how many vineyard dates weren't romantic at all. How many were carefully staged meetings where marriage contracts were implied, alliances cemented, and debts exchanged over cups of perfumed red. Historians have found fragments of papyrus detailing wine lists, prepared for royal banquets, and some are more revealing than you'd expect. Beside each amphora's name, tiny marginal notes hint at their intended recipients. For the nobleman of Memphis, speak softly of tribute. For the high priest, discuss the temple's share. For the foreign envoy, ensure loyalty is secured. But one entry, almost erased, reads, for the queen's guest, sealed and sweetened. No one knows who that guest was. And perhaps no one's meant to. The deeper you move into this hidden world, the clearer it becomes. Vineyards weren't just romantic playgrounds. They were political chessboards disguised in perfume and starlight. Beneath the canopy of grapes, whispers of love mingled seamlessly with schemes of power. A single misstep here could spark scandal, or war. Take the story of Neferhotep, a minor courtier in Akhenaten's reign. According to a series of recovered temple letters, Neferhotep brokered an illicit arrangement between a foreign merchant and the royal household, promising amphorae from sacred temple vineyards in exchange for rare Syrian cedarwood. Somewhere in the exchange, a private rendezvous was arranged, one involving the merchant, Neferhotep's sister, and a stash of forbidden honeyed wine. When the affair was discovered, the records grow strangely silent. Neferhotep vanishes from palace rosters within weeks. The merchant? Gone from Nile trade logs entirely. The wine, however, that wine shows up years later, unopened, in the tomb of an unknown noblewoman buried with a lotus amulet pressed between her hands. Coincidence? Maybe. But in Egypt, where wine flowed as easily as secrets, maybe not. You find yourself near a small, secluded alcove carved into the vineyard's sandstone wall, where faded reliefs depict a feast scene. Figures recline beneath grape-laden trellises, cups raised, laughter frozen mid-gesture. But here's what catches your attention. Tucked into the corner, half hidden beneath curling vines, 2 smaller figures exchange an amphora, their hands touching ever so slightly. It's subtle, but deliberate. The artist knew what they were carving. And it makes you wonder, how many alliances were born here, under the excuse of Hathor's blessing and Delta wine, while the rest of the world believed it was all music and harvests. But perhaps the most fascinating relic tied to vineyard power comes from Thebes. A sealed amphora unearthed in a royal storeroom, its wax intact, its hieratic script still legible. The inscription reads, "For the night when the river meets the stars." No records explain what that night was, who attended, or what promises were made over that particular wine. But researchers analyzing residue inside the jar discovered traces of blue lotus, cinnamon, and wild honey, a blend reserved for occasions so rare they left no written records at all. You imagine the scene, a private gathering deep within temple walls, where lamps burned low and shadows curled against gilded pillars. A handful of figures seated cross-legged around a single amphora, its stopper pulled slowly, deliberately. No one speaks. The silence itself is in agreement, unbroken even as the first pour touches their lips. Somewhere beyond the rows, you hear the distant clang of a cup falling onto stone, followed by a startled laugh quickly swallowed into silence. You picture someone offering the wrong amphora to the wrong person, a tiny misstep that might ripple into scandal by morning. You almost feel sorry for them, but in this world, you suspect such mistakes weren't easily forgiven. Here, wine wasn't just indulgence. It was currency. A bribe. A promise. A threat. In the right hands, a single amphora could forge loyalty, reshape dynasties, or ruin lives. And standing here, beneath these same tangled vines, you feel it lingering still, the weight of power disguised as sweetness, the echoes of whispers traded between cup and lip, the softest touch of a promise that could change everything. The vineyard is quiet tonight, too quiet. You step carefully between the rows of tangled vines, your sandals brushing against the damp earth, and you can almost feel the weight of untold secrets pressing down on the still air. Somewhere in the distance, a faint lute hums lazily from the feast, but here, hidden beneath the stars, this place feels different. Heavier. Because now we're stepping into dangerous territory, the scandals buried beneath the vines. The stories people whispered behind closed doors, the names that vanished from temple records, the secrets powerful families spent generations trying to erase. And the deeper we go, the juicier it gets. It starts with a single papyrus fragment, discovered in Thebes, brittle and stained but still legible. It mentions an unnamed vineyard along the Nile where an evening of Hathor's blessing spiraled into chaos unfit to record. That's it. No details. No explanations. Just that ominous phrase. Historians, of course, couldn't resist speculating. Some suggest a political negotiation went wrong. Others whisper about an affair between a royal priestess and a visiting foreign envoy. Whatever happened, the records beyond that line go silent, deliberately it seems. Pages are missing, names scraped from stone. And yet fragments keep surfacing in unexpected places, like breadcrumbs leading you through the vines. You pass beneath a sagging trellis where two amphorae sit tipped on their sides, their clay cracked and blackened by age. Near them, scratched faintly into the limestone wall, you spot a single hieroglyph repeated 3 times, a lotus, Hathor's symbol, used here like a secret signature. And suddenly, the rumors make sense. Some vineyard scandals were never meant to be remembered in writing. They were coded, hidden behind symbols, paintings, and small offerings buried in shallow soil. A carved lotus near a broken amphora? It might mean a lover's meeting discovered. Two lotus symbols etched side by side? A liaison approved, blessed even. But 3 lotuses? That was gossip too dangerous to speak aloud. One story, half preserved in a merchant's ledger, tells of a high-ranking nobleman's wife who slipped away during a harvest feast, vanishing into the vines with a young musician hired to play at the celebration. Witnesses swore they saw them beneath the trellis, shadows tangled, before the two disappeared entirely. Days later, the musician was gone, erased from rosters, his belongings confiscated. The noblewoman? Returned home quietly, her name never spoken again in temple prayers. Her family donated an unusually generous gift to Hathor's priests shortly afterward, and the matter was buried, along with, perhaps, more than one secret. You duck beneath a low arch of vines and find a flat slab of sandstone carved with what looks like a festival scene. Couples lounging, dancers spinning, cups raised beneath the great heavy trellises. But tucked into the bottom corner, so faint you almost miss it, are 2 small stick figures standing apart from the others, holding hands beneath the shadow of a palm tree. Above them, a single lotus symbol glows faintly in the lamplight. It's subtle, like an artist's wink. A quiet nod to a forbidden romance everyone knew about but no one dared to name. Not all scandals were romantic, though. Some were tangled knots of power, inheritance, and betrayal, where wine was the pretext but politics pulled the strings. Take the infamous case of Horemheb's Vineyard Pact, mentioned in temple records and whispered about for centuries. A scribe from Karnak claimed that 3 noble houses met secretly in the vineyards during a festival, where an alliance was sealed over a single amphora of Delta's rarest blend. The agreement allegedly shifted land rights, redirected temple funds, and, according to later gossip, set off a chain of accidental deaths within 2 of the families. Was it coincidence? A bad vintage? Or was the wine laced with something less divine? No one agrees. But the amphora tied to that night was found decades later, buried beneath the Nile silt, its wax seal still intact. Inside, residue revealed traces of mandrake root, known for its powerful sedative effects. Mandrake, a plant often used in love potions, and sometimes in less romantic recipes. You stop near a half-buried amphora, its side etched with a tiny hieratic phrase. The river knows what the lips cannot speak. It's beautiful, haunting, and unsettling, once you know the context. Historians believe this line refers to a royal court scandal involving an envoy from Nubia, a priestess sworn to celibacy, and a cache of perfumed blue lotus wine. The affair allegedly jeopardized an entire trade agreement. Within a season, the envoy was reassigned, the priestess, retired, into temple seclusion, and every record of the incident erased from archives. Except this one line, carved quietly into an amphora wall like someone couldn't stand letting the truth vanish entirely. And yet, for every documented whisper, there are hints of countless more. Tiny symbols hidden on vineyard walls. Fragments of papyrus buried under roots. Songs performed once, then forbidden. The deeper archaeologists dig, the more these buried stories surface, but never fully. It's like the vines themselves guard their secrets, releasing them only in pieces, just enough to tease, never enough to satisfy. You crouch beneath a low-hanging canopy and run your fingertips along a weathered stone where faint markings linger. At first glance, it's just scratches, but as you trace the lines, you realize it's a map. Not of the vineyard, but of hidden alcoves, secluded spots marked with symbols for meeting safe and blessed. 3 of the alcoves are crossed out. You lean back slowly, the cool earth pressing against your palms, and a shiver crawls up your spine. Whatever happened there, it was significant enough to mark forever, and dangerous enough to erase afterward. Somewhere far away, the faint echoes of laughter drift through the vines, soft and brittle. A frog croaks lazily near the irrigation channel, and a dry breeze stirs loose sand around your feet. But beneath all of it, the silence feels louder now, thicker, like the vineyard is holding its breath. And as you walk back toward the rows, you realize something important. History remembers kings and wars, temples and tombs, but here, beneath the vines, entire lifetimes lived and ended in whispers. Affairs that altered lineages. Secrets that shaped alliances. Scandals that never saw daylight, yet left fingerprints on the world we inherited. It makes you wonder, how many stories still lie buried here, waiting, patient, hidden in the soil until the Nile decides it's time to let them breathe again. The night settles heavier now, as though the vineyard itself is holding its breath. The feasting is far behind you, just a faint ripple of distant music and laughter carried weakly on the Nile breeze. Here, among the twisted vines and ancient soil, you feel as if you've stepped through a veil into someplace quieter, older, almost sacred. Because tonight we're stepping into the space where myth and memory blur, where the stories people whispered about their gods became shields, excuses, and sometimes, invitations. The vineyard wasn't just where people came to steal kisses. It was where they came to borrow divinity to justify them. You pause beneath a low trellis heavy with grapes, their skins glossy under moonlight, and your fingers brush the wooden post where a faded carving lingers, two intertwining vines curling upward toward a lotus flower. It's not just decoration. This is Hathor's symbol again, and you're starting to realize she wasn't merely worshipped here, she was summoned. Hathor, goddess of love, music, wine, and pleasure, ruled more than temples and festivals, she ruled the stories. If two people disappeared into the vines during a feast, explanations were rarely offered. Instead, someone would smile, lower their voice, and murmur, "Hathor willed it." A perfect alibi, blessed by divine authority. Honestly, if you think about it, that's the ancient equivalent of saying, "Don't ask questions, it's part of the ritual." But Hathor wasn't the only goddess invoked in these hidden vineyard rites. There's Isis, the divine mother, said to weave fates in silence beneath the stars. Her myths spoke of love reborn and bodies pieced back together, of loyalty so deep it defied death itself. For some couples, invoking Isis during vineyard offerings was a quiet way of asking for something more lasting, a promise stronger than secrecy. One fragment of papyrus describes a ritual performed beneath the vines during the festival of drunkenness. Yes, that was a real celebration, where lovers offered lotus wine to Isis in exchange for binding the hearts across many lives. Historians still debate whether this was symbolic or literal, but the imagery alone feels timeless. Two people kneeling side by side, pouring wine into the soil, whispering hopes too fragile to say aloud. And then there's Bes, the short, bearded dwarf god with a lion's mane, protector of love, dance, and all things slightly mischievous. His carved amulets, often tucked discreetly into linen folds, appear everywhere in vineyard excavations. One even shows him mid-dance, holding a cup in one hand and a sistrum in the other, grinning wide like he knows something everyone else doesn't. Bes was different from Hathor and Isis. He wasn't solemn, wasn't distant. He was messy, playful, deeply involved in mortal affairs, the divine wingman, if you will. Couples sometimes whispered his name before sharing their first cup of wine together, believing he'd sweeten the air. And loosen guarded tongues. You imagine someone muttering a quick, "Bess, don't fail me now," right before confessing a secret under the vines, and honestly, you can't help but smile. But myths weren't just tools for blessing, they were shields. Some of the most controversial vineyard encounters, forbidden matches, political liaisons, or risky affairs, were hidden behind the stories people told about the gods. Imagine this: a noblewoman slips away during the festival, vanishing into the vines with someone her family would never approve. Hours later, questions arise. Where was she? Why did she leave? And the answer, whispered smoothly, almost rehearsed. She joined a Hathoric rite. A private offering. No one asks more. Who dares challenge the will of the goddess of love? It's brilliant, really, mythology used not just for faith, but for freedom. One of the most haunting vineyard discoveries supports this idea. Archaeologists uncovered a sealed clay jar buried beneath a trellis near Memphis. Inside, they found fragments of papyrus carefully rolled and wrapped in linen, their ink still faintly legible. Hathor, bind our names in the silence of your vines. No signatures. No dates. Just that single plea. Some believe these were prayers left behind after secret meetings, tokens meant to disappear into the soil, whispered confessions offered to the goddess instead of the world. Others argue they were insurance, evidence hidden away in case someone dared deny what happened. Either way, you hold the words in your hands now, centuries later, and they still feel warm. Then there are the myths made practical, little stories designed to mask rituals that weren't entirely religious but looked pious enough to pass scrutiny. For example, a popular vineyard tale claimed that Hathor's blessings only reached those who shared their wine. In shadowed silence, couples would step into narrow alcoves of vines, kneeling together, sipping from the same cup while murmuring private prayers. To an outsider, it looked perfectly respectable, worshipful, even. But in reality, these alcoves became havens where longing hid behind ritual, where secrets blurred into faith so seamlessly no one could tell the difference. And if someone did raise an eyebrow afterward? Well, blame the goddess. But not every vineyard myth was divine permission. Some were warnings. Stories designed to keep people cautious, even afraid. One particularly eerie tale speaks of a shadowed figure called the Watcher of Vines, said to be a priest of Hathor, cursed for desecrating the goddess's rites. According to the myth, he wanders the vineyards during festivals, invisible except for the faint chime of anklets as he walks, punishing those who take pleasure without offering gratitude. Archaeologists even found an amulet depicting a hooded figure with grape leaves carved into its robe, possibly linked to this legend. You smile faintly, though, imagining parents retelling this myth to teenagers sneaking into the vines. Behave yourselves, or the Watcher will find you. Ancient scare tactics never go out of style. But the deeper you go, the clearer the truth becomes. Myth wasn't separate from these vineyards. It was woven into their very soil, their very air. The gods gave lovers language when society didn't, courage when fear held them silent, and excuses when consequences loomed too close. Every amphora poured, every lotus offering left behind, every whispered name in the dark, they weren't just romantic gestures. They were invocations, quiet bargains with forces bigger than themselves. And somewhere, beneath this endless web of vines, you can almost feel Hathor smiling still, as though she knows exactly how many stories have been born and buried here under her gaze. The night grows quieter as you drift deeper into the vineyard, and the hum of distant music fades into little more than a memory. Overhead, the moon leans low, painting the rows of grapes in muted silver. You pause beneath a trellis, fingertips brushing against smooth leaves, and for a moment, the silence feels heavy, almost like the vines themselves are waiting for you to listen. Because now, we step away from the stories whispered beneath these leaves, and into the voices still arguing about them today. Historians, archaeologists, poets of data and fragments. And the funny thing? They don't agree on anything. Some say these vineyard rendezvous were everywhere, as common as wine itself along the Nile. They point to carvings, graffiti, poems etched into broken amphorae, and half-buried tokens left behind in the soil. The evidence, they argue, isn't subtle, it's overwhelming. Like the shard discovered near Thebes, painted with two figures seated beneath a grape-laden trellis, their fingertips almost touching. Or the tiny inscription carved into sandstone at Memphis. Under these leaves I found her voice sweeter than wine. To some scholars, these are more than isolated artifacts, they're threads in a wider tapestry of everyday intimacy. They believe the vineyards weren't just occasional hiding places but thriving hubs of private longing, little sanctuaries where rules bent softly under the gaze of Hathor. But not everyone agrees. Others insist the opposite, that we've romanticized scattered hints into entire narratives. They argue that the artifacts we found, a handful of poems, a few scratched symbols, fragments of clay, represent rare exceptions, not common practice. According to this view, ancient Egyptian society, particularly among elites, was far stricter about propriety than we imagine. Vineyard dates, they say, weren't an everyday phenomenon but carefully timed, discreet indulgences reserved for festivals, when crowds gave couples anonymity. One researcher famously quipped, "If the vines could talk, they'd whisper less than we think." You can't help but smile at that. Maybe they're right. Or maybe they've just never had a glass of Delta wine on a summer night under a full moon. A third camp offers something in between, arguing that the truth is more complicated than either extreme. They suggest the vineyards were elastic spaces, flexible zones where social boundaries blurred temporarily, but only under very specific conditions. Festivals, when music, wine, and crowding gave cover for secrets. Blessings, when invoking Hathor or Bes turned stolen moments into ritual. Neutrality, when vineyards belonging to temples or communal estates created zones where multiple classes mingled naturally. In this view, vineyard dates weren't constant but weren't rare either. They were negotiated freedoms, precious, fleeting, and context-dependent. You wander past a low stone wall where archaeologists unearthed more than 100 carved symbols clustered tightly together: lotuses, falcons, cups, and even 2 miniature stick figures holding hands. The interpretations vary wildly. Some scholars see this as proof of countless vineyard rendezvous etched into eternity. Others believe it's decorative, a flourish, not a diary. One researcher even suggested the carvings might have been practice marks by apprentices learning to etch stone. Another countered with, "So why would they practice carving holding hands?" Cue another academic shouting match, and somewhere, you suspect, the vines are laughing softly to themselves. Part of the problem, of course, is the silence of time. Papyrus rots. Linen decays. Ink fades. Most of what survives are durable things: stone, clay, and pottery. And yet, longing rarely writes itself on stone. Lovers didn't leave formal declarations chiseled into temple walls for future scholars to debate. They whispered them into the night, offered them to Hathor, folded them into amulets, and tucked them into the soil where no one would ever find them. So we're left with fragments, a handful of clues scattered like stars, too far apart to see the whole constellation. And yet there's something strangely comforting about that, isn't there? Because even in their arguments, historians agree on one thing: people were here. They touched these vines, pressed these grapes, carved these symbols. They prayed to Hathor, left offerings in the soil, traded gifts, and exchanged glances that no amount of lost papyrus can erase. A single line on a clay shard, written 3,000 years ago, still hums with meaning beneath your fingertips. I met you by taste before I knew your name. Is that proof of a cultural phenomenon? Or just one person, on one night, remembering a single sip of lotus wine and the sound of someone's laughter? Maybe we'll never know. And maybe that's exactly the point. You step beneath another trellis, the grapes above you glowing faintly like strings of dark glass beads. Somewhere nearby, a frog plops into the shallow irrigation channel, sending soft ripples across the water. A breeze brushes your cheek, carrying the faint perfume of crushed petals and fermenting fruit. The longer you walk, the more you realize something historians rarely admit: certainty isn't the goal. The fragments left behind aren't puzzles to solve but echoes to listen to. We don't need the full picture to feel the heartbeat here. We don't need all the words to understand the silence between them. Maybe vineyard dates were common. Maybe they weren't. But either way, the soil remembers. The vineyard is quiet now. The music from the feast has faded into nothing, swallowed by the night, leaving only the soft hum of insects and the slow breathing of the Nile in the distance. You stand beneath a trellis where moonlight drips through tangled leaves, painting pale patterns on the earth. And for the first time tonight, you let yourself just listen. There's no laughter here. No whispering voices. No footsteps crunching against damp soil. But somehow, you feel them, the ghosts of everyone who's walked these same paths, carrying their tiny, fragile hopes beneath the vines. Thousands of nights like this. Thousands of secrets folded into the shadows, sealed into the earth, breathed into the air. And in the stillness, you realize, the vineyard remembers. You take a slow step forward, fingertips brushing across the rough bark of a wooden post. Its surface is carved with tiny grooves, names worn away, symbols blurred into nothing. Once these markings were urgent, desperate. Tonight, they're just faint shadows. A breeze stirs the leaves overhead, and the scent of the grapes clings to the air, sweet, heavy, almost overripe. It mixes with damp earth and something faintly floral, like the ghost of a perfume someone wore here 3,000 years ago. You breathe in deeply, and for a moment, time folds. You hear the rustle of linen robes, the soft chime of anklets brushing sand, the low ripple of laughter pressed between two quiet breaths. A clay cup tips somewhere nearby. You can almost hear it roll softly into the soil, and two silhouettes slip away beneath a curtain of vines, their hands brushing, their laughter swallowed instantly by the night. You blink, and they're gone. Farther ahead, the irrigation channel glimmers faintly, reflecting thin silver lines of starlight. A frog plops lazily into the water, ripples spreading out like whispers you can't quite catch. You crouch near the edge, fingertips tracing the smooth, cool stones lining the bank. They've been polished by centuries of river floods, worn by hands carrying amphorae offerings, little tokens meant to last longer than the people who left them. Maybe they succeeded. Maybe they didn't. You look down at the soil and wonder how many stories sleep here, sealed inside broken jars, tiny carved beads, dried lotus petals, forgotten prayers written on papyrus so thin it dissolved in the damp air long ago. You wonder if any of those lovers imagined you, here, now, tracing their shadows under the same leaves, breathing the same Nile wind. Somewhere beyond the vines, an owl calls softly, its wings slicing the air in silence. The sound barely stirs the quiet, but you follow it anyway, drawn deeper into the vineyard until you reach a clearing. Here, the moon opens wide above you, casting pale light across low stone walls and half-buried amphorae. You kneel beside one, brushing away sand until faint painted lines emerge, two intertwined vines curling around a lotus flower. The same symbol you've seen scattered all night, here again, steady, eternal. You rest your palm against the jar's surface, and it's cool, smoother than you expect. You close your eyes and imagine the hands that touched it last, someone carrying it carefully, offering its sweetness beneath this very sky. You wonder if they knew this moment would vanish, if they thought their love would dissolve with time, or if they believed, stubbornly, that it would last forever. And in some strange way it has. You lie back on the soft earth, staring up at the constellations tangled between the vines. The stars look the same as they did thousands of years ago, unchanged, unbothered by your presence. Maybe that's why the people who came here turned to them for comfort, constant, eternal, patient witnesses to fleeting lives and fragile promises. The air is warm against your skin, humming faintly with the rhythm of cicadas. Your breathing slows, matching the slow, quiet heartbeat of the night around you. For a moment, you let go of questions, arguments, debates. You stop trying to piece together what was ritual, what was rebellion, what was real, what was imagined. Because here, beneath these vines, everything blurs. Myth and memory. Faith and desire. Past and present. And somehow, all of it feels alive still. You close your eyes and let the silence deepen, until even your thoughts move softly. In the dark, you can almost hear their voices again. A laugh carried on the Nile breeze. A prayer murmured into the soil. A promise whispered beneath the leaves. None of it written. None of it kept. And yet, somehow, it lingers. The vineyard holds it all. And maybe, tonight, you take something with you, too, not a fact, not a name, but a feeling, that life isn't made of grand stories carved into stone, but of tiny ones left in fragments, hidden beneath vines and petals, waiting quietly for someone to notice. You breathe deeply, one last time, letting the scents of crushed grapes, lotus, and warm earth fill your lungs, and you feel your shoulders loosen, your chest soften, your thoughts finally begin to drift. The voices fade. The vines fall silent. And the night carries you gently into its arms. End of script. Sweet dreams.